Dana White's risky journey to UFC success. Dana White is the president and public face of Ultimate Fighting, or UFC, the world's largest mixed martial arts or MMA organization. He often represents the UFC in press conferences, interviews, and overseas fights with his outspoken comments and criticisms. Despite the controversy surrounding him and his tough and aggressive personality, he is a brilliant businessman who is dedicated to the world of fighting. The UFC in the 2000s was close to bankruptcy and carried a barbaric image that was subject to public perception and political backlash. But under his management, the UFC now has 350 employees worldwide and 7,800 fighters under UFC contract. He is now known to have a wealth of $150 million, living in a luxurious mansion in Fine Island Court, Las Vegas. Plus, he has a collection of luxury cars in his garage. In an interview, he said, "I love what I do. I love this business. I love everything about it." Today, we will take a look at how Dana White built the UFC to be as big as it is today. Before we go any further, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to this channel. Dana White is the second child of Jane White and Dana White Sr. He was born in Manchester, Connecticut on July 28, 1969. He is an Irish American who spent his childhood in Ware, Massachusetts. When her parents divorced, Dana and her older sister, Kelly White, were mostly raised by her mother and her mother's Catholic family, while her father, Dana, describes him as alcoholic and selfish. He didn't care much for him or his sister. Her mother worked as a nurse. When Dana was years old, they moved to Las Vegas because her mother was offered a higher-paying job. He met his future wife, Ann Stella, when they were both in 8th grade. Ann married Dana in 1996, and they have 2 sons and a daughter. Dana attended Bishop Gorman High School, which turned out to be the same school where his later business partner, Lorenzo Fertitta, went to. At that time, they were not friends and never even talked. Dana, who disliked school, was expelled twice, but eventually graduated in 1987 from Herman High School. During her high school years, Dana spent much of her time with her maternal grandparents in Levant, Maine, a small town not far from Bangor. Dana tried to continue his education at Quincy College, then at UMass Boston, but he dropped out each semester of college. He then worked odd jobs as an asphalt mason, bouncer at an Irish bar, and bellman at the Boston Harbor Hotel when he was 19 years old. As he worked, Dana realized that he didn't like his job. At 17, he met the legendary street boxer and former Golden Gloves winner Peter Welch. Dana asked him to teach him, and Peter agreed. From there, they became friends. Dana briefly considered a career as a professional fighter, but was discouraged when he saw a fighter with brain damage. Dana ended up working as a boxercise trainer, which was the first time Dana got involved in the fighter business. The bigger the business became, the more his love for fighting grew. One day, the mobster Whitey Bulger's men suddenly visited him in the middle of the class Dana was teaching. At that time, Dana had a debt of $25,000 to Whitey and Kevin Weeks. At the age of 21, he didn't have that much money. Another time, he was called and asked to pay the money by tomorrow at 1 p.m. This brought him to Las Vegas, the fighting capital of the world. In Las Vegas, Dana lived in Sin City, which has many boxing gyms. He worked at a gym called United Champion to earn money, but his schedule was so busy that he didn't have time to go to his friends' weddings, except for one. Adam Corrigan is his schoolmate, who always wakes him up to go to school and picks him up from home to school every day. Adam's persistence in forcing Dana into something doesn't seem to change, even though they've grown up. Adam kept contacting Dana to get him to come to his wedding, so he had no excuse not to come. It turns out that Adam's wedding was the starting point of the UFC. Dana reunited with Lorenzo Fertitta and his brother Frank Fertitta after about 6 or 10 years. The Fertitta Brothers are wealthy businessmen who own Station Casinos, the largest gaming company in Las Vegas. In addition, they are also boxing enthusiasts. Dana and Lorenzo talked about fighting, and that's where their friendship began. Lorenzo often fights with Dana every Monday. Dana also began training jiu-jitsu with the Fertitta Brothers in. It was Dana who introduced them to John Lewis, a competitor from UFC 22 and UFC 28. Since he started practicing jiu-jitsu, he often met UFC fighters. He met MMA fighters Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz and had the opportunity to become their manager to replace Sal Garcia. One day, he was offered a job at the World Fighting Alliance, or WFA, with the promise of a big salary and a house. In November 2000s, Dana got a call from Bob Merowitz, the owner of Semaphore Entertainment Group, which was the UFC's Indu company at the time. Hearing the news, Dana immediately contacted Lorenzo to ask if he was interested in acquiring the UFC. After that, he connected Lorenzo with Bob. They began talks about purchasing the company. In January, UFC was successfully purchased for $1 million by Fertitta Brothers, becoming a subsidiary of Zuffa. Dana was appointed president of the UFC and given 10% of the shares. The Fertitta Brothers and Dana were left with the UFC brand, an old wooden octagon, and about 12 or 13 contracts. Bob sold all the company's assets to avoid bankruptcy. He sold the merchandise rights, DVD rights, and video game rights. An old library was also bought by Lionsgate. Even the UFC.com website was sold to a company called User Friendly Computer. UFC was developed with money invested by the Fertitta Brothers. Dana is trying to improve the image of the UFC, which is notorious for bars and is considered an illegal sport. Utilizing the expertise of Lorenzo, who had served on the Nevada State Athletic Commission, he used his valuable knowledge of sports management. They worked together to get clear regulations and sanctions for MMA. They persuaded different athletic jurisdictions to legalize it. To get pay-per-view revenue, the UFC needed a platform to distribute their shows. Dana then got a deal from DirecTV, bringing the UFC back to pay-per-view through the UFC Vegas event. Dana hopes that the event can make viewers realize that the fight is a sport. He is trying to get rid of the old UFC marketing that was always associated with blood, violence, and danger. Instead, Dana wants to give the image of UFC as a more humane sport, where the audience does not have to worry about one of the two players dying. They got sponsors. The UFC also got an invitation from Donald Trump for them to hold shows at his casino, Trump Taj Mahal, twice in 2002. That same year, Dana made a deal with Fox and brought UFC shows to cable television with UFC 37 and UFC A2. As a result, these fights became more commonly watched. Fans also have easier access to UFC content. Dana's efforts proved successful when tickets for the UFC 40 show sold out at the MGM Grand Arena and sold 150,000 pay-per-views, showing that UFC fights are increasingly accepted by the public. About 3 or 4 years after the UFC was acquired by Zuffa and led by Dana, the successful promotions resulted in a deficit of $1 million. The Fertitta Brothers would have given up if the loss could not be overcome. Dana tried to find a way out to maintain the UFC, especially after the image of the sport of MMA was getting better in the eyes of the public. He came up with the idea to create a reality show for the growing number of UFC fans called The Ultimate Fighter. The show, produced in September and October, aired on Spike TV, where the Fertitta Brothers invested their last $1 million in the UFC. If the show failed, the UFC would disband. The show aired in 2005 with no commercials at all, but it attracted million viewers and the audience kept rising from episode to episode. In the 5th episode, they managed to get a fantastic viewership of around 2.3 to 2.4 million viewers. In the midst of the Ultimate Fighter's success, President Spike was suddenly fired without any confirmation to the UFC. Dana immediately flew to his New York-based office, but none of Spike's representatives would meet him. They hadn't discussed airing the Season 2 finale. The popularity of UFC could easily be lost. Production costs will not be covered if the next season cannot be aired. Luckily, the fight between Forrest Griffin and Stephen Bonnar managed to attract attention and save UFC. The greatest and most intense fight. The audience shouted for one more round while the fighter was already bleeding. The judges then awarded UFC contracts to Forrest and Stephen. The UFC benefited from broadcast rights for the next few years from Spike TV. UFC's pay-per-view exploded, earning up to $223 million in 2006. The shows were aired all over America, providing the opportunity to produce more of The Ultimate Fighter. As time passed, the UFC began to dominate MMA fighting. Strikeforce was purchased by the Zuffa Company in March 2011, bringing female fighters to the UFC. It's breaking Dana's narrow view of female fighters. One of the most famous interviews about it came from TMZ Sports in 2011. When he was asked, "When will we see women in the UFC?" he replied, "Never." The first women's bout in the UFC, Ronda Rousey versus Liz Carmouche, seems to have broken Dana's mind. As Ronda's popularity grew, so did the growth of female MMA. And there are now several female MMA stars such as Amanda Nunes, Chris Cyborg, and Valentina Shevchenko. In 2015, it is known that UFC gross revenue reached $600 million. Then, on July 11, 2016, Lorenzo confirmed that the UFC had been sold to a consortium of investors owned by William Morris Endeavor International Management Group, or WME-IMG, for $4.025 billion. Dana was appointed Chief Executive Officer, or CEO, of the UFC. After the acquisition, the UFC brand skyrocketed. Fighters were brought to the mainstream, putting them on par with celebrities or other top athletes. William utilized his extensive network in the entertainment industry to discuss high-value broadcast contracts, major sponsorship deals, and involve other talents in UFC promotions and shows. The UFC announced that Dana will host Dana White's Contender Series event in May. The event aims to give fighters on the cusp of popularity a chance to showcase their talents so they can realize their dreams of fighting in the UFC. The event will exclusively air on UFC Fight Pass, a digital streaming service promoted and licensed separately from the UFC brand. March 18, 2019, Dana signed a new 7-year contract as UFC CEO, following the UFC's deal with ESPN. As the pandemic began to spread around the world, including the United States, many companies began to lay off their employees. Dana refused to lay off his employees, even though the organization of any sporting events began to be banned by the government. The disaster became a big challenge for him to find a way out so that the UFC could still get income, especially since pay-per-view is still an important source of income for the UFC. Dana took great care of his employees' needs during the quarantine period. He gave his personal money to make sure his employees did not lack primary or secondary needs or get sick. To organize live fights and produce content for fans, he rented a deserted island in Yas Island, Abu Dhabi. Before entering the island, everyone is required to check in Abu Dhabi. Without hesitation, Dana hired many scientists and built a lab to support his plan. Dana deliberately did not tell the media about the location of the private island he used to organize the competition. He knew some media outlets would create a negative narrative and derail his plans. In an interview, he said, "I can hide from the pandemic for a very long time and be good, but my employees can't." Ignoring media criticism is the best solution.